Hanged for infertility, saved by a lone cowboy, the untold journey of two Apache brides. The sun rose slowly over the wide desert, painting the sky with soft shades of orange and pink. The land stretched endlessly, filled with rocky hills, dry sand, and scattered bushes that clung stubbornly to life. In the distance, a small Apache camp came alive as the first light touched the tip of the wooden huts and teepees. Smoke curled gently into the sky from morning fires, and the quiet stillness of the night began to fade. Inside the camp, people were already awake. Women moved carefully between the huts, carrying water in clay pots or stirring thin porridge over glowing embers. Children ran barefoot across the dusty ground, laughing and chasing each other, their small voices echoing through the open space. Older men sat near the fire, speaking in low tones about the coming day, the hunt, and the safety of the tribe. At the heart of the camp stood two young women who would soon be known as Apache brides. They were named Nalin and Saba. Both had grown up in the same settlement, learning the ways of their people from a very young age. They had watched their mothers grind corn, weave baskets, and prepare hides. They had listened to their elders tell stories of brave warriors, ancient spirits, and the sacred bond between the land and the tribe. Nalin was tall and quiet, with deep dark eyes that seemed to hold many thoughts. She spoke softly and moved with calm grace. People often said she had a gentle heart, always willing to help others without complaint. As a child, she had cared for younger children in the camp and had shown great patience even in difficult moments. Sava, on the other hand, was lively and strong-willed. She had a bright smile and a voice that carried easily across the camp. She was known for her courage and her skill in gathering food from the desert, wild berries, roots, and herbs that could heal or nourish. Many admired her spirit, but some elders worried that she was too bold for a traditional Apache woman. One warm evening, as the sun began to sink behind the distant mountains, a sacred ceremony was held in the center of the camp. Drums beat slowly, and a sacred fire burned brightly. The entire tribe gathered in a wide circle, dressed in their best garments made of soft leather and decorated with beads and feathers. That night, Nalin and Sava were chosen as brides for two respected Apache warriors. The men were named Talo and Hekini. Both were known for their strength, bravery, and loyalty to the tribe. They had fought to protect the camp from danger and had proven themselves worthy in the eyes of the elders. When the announcement was made, Nalin felt her heart pound. She stood still, her hands trembling slightly, but she kept her head high. She had always known that one day she would be chosen, yet the reality of it made her feel both honored and afraid. She looked toward Talo, who stood tall and serious, his face calm but filled with pride. Sava felt differently. She smiled, but her mind raced with questions. She respected Hekani, but she wondered what her new life would be like. Would she still have freedom? Would she be able to follow her own path? Still, she accepted her fate with strength, reminding herself that marriage was a sacred duty. The ceremony lasted long into the night. The elders sang ancient songs that echoed through the desert air. The flames of the fire danced, casting moving shadows on the faces of the gathered people. As Nalin and Sava stood beside their future husbands, they were blessed with prayers for unity, strength, and future children who would carry on the Apache bloodline. In the days that followed, life in the camp continued as usual, but everything felt different for the two young women. They moved into new huts with their husbands, leaving behind their childhood homes. Their mothers and older female relatives taught them how to care for their new families, manage supplies, and show respect to their husbands and elders. Nalin adjusted slowly. She missed the comfort of her mother's presence but tried to remain strong. Every morning she fetched water from the nearby stream, prepared meals, and helped other women with their daily tasks. Talo treated her with kindness, rarely raising his voice and often watching over her with quiet concern. Sava adapted more quickly. She took charge of her new space with confidence, organizing her hut and helping other women whenever she could. Hekini admired her spirit, though sometimes he worried that her independence might clash with tribal expectations. Seasons passed, the desert shifted from dry heat to cool winds and back again. The tribe moved occasionally to follow water and food sources. Through it all, Nalin and Sava continued their lives as Apache wives, learning, growing, and hoping. Yet beneath their calm surface both women carried a silent worry. In Apache culture, bearing children was not only a personal joy, but a sacred responsibility. Children were seen as the future of the tribe, the continuation of their people, their traditions, and their spirit. As months turned into years, Nalin and Sava did not become mothers. At first, no one spoke of it. People assumed it was simply a matter of time. The elders believed that the spirits would bless them when the moment was right. But as more time passed, quiet whispers began to circulate through the camp. Some women exchanged concerned glances when Nalin walked by. Others spoke in hushed tones behind Sava's back. Though no one openly accused them, the tension slowly grew like a shadow they could not escape. Nalin felt this change deeply. She noticed how conversations stopped when she approached. She saw pity in some eyes and doubt in others. At night, she often lay awake beside Tylo, staring at the darkness and wondering why the spirits had not chosen her to be a mother. Tylo tried to comfort her. He reminded her that she was still valued, still respected, and still loved. Yet even he could not fully hide the disappointment that weighed heavily on his heart, for he too felt the pressure of tradition. Sava faced the situation with more outward strength. When other women whispered, she held her head high and refused to show fear. Still, inside she felt an aching emptiness. She longed to hold a child in her arms, to hear a baby's laughter, and to teach her son or daughter the ways of their people. Some nights, Sava walked alone beyond the camp, standing beneath the wide sky filled with bright stars. She prayed silently to the spirits, asking for guidance, mercy, and understanding. The wind carried her soft voice across the desert, but no answer came. Meanwhile, life in the camp grew more tense. The elders began to watch Nalin and Sava more closely. In their minds, the survival of the tribe depended on strong families and many children. Infertility, though not fully understood, was seen as a bad sign, a disruption in the natural balance of life. Despite this growing unease, Nalin and Sava continued to support each other. They formed a quiet bond, sharing their fears, hopes, and prayers. Often, they sat together near the river, speaking softly about their childhood memories, their dreams, and their deep connection to the land. The desert around them remained vast and beautiful, filled with golden light at dawn and deep purple shadows at dusk. Eagles soared high above, and the sound of distant drums still echoed through the nights. Yet beneath this beauty, an invisible storm was slowly gathering, one that would change their lives forever. For now, Nalin and Sava remained two young Apache brides, living between duty and desire, faith and fear, hope and uncertainty. Their journey had only just begun, and the path ahead was far more difficult than they could ever imagine. The dry season arrived early that year, and the Apache camp felt different from before. The wind carried more dust, the river shrank, and the air held a heavy stillness that made people uneasy. Every morning, the elders gathered near the main fire to speak about supplies, movement of the tribe, and signs from the spirits. Their faces were serious, and their voices were lower than usual. Inside the camp, daily life continued, but the warmth that once filled the community had faded slightly. Laughter was softer, conversations were shorter, and people seemed more cautious with their words. Nalin and Sava noticed this change more than anyone else. They could feel eyes following them when they walked, and sometimes they caught pieces of whispered talk that quickly stopped when they came near. Nalin woke one dawn to the sound of distant drums. She stepped outside her hut and saw smoke rising from the elders' fire. Several older men and women sat in a tight circle, speaking in deep, serious tones. Talo stood nearby, his arms crossed, his face hard and unreadable. He did not look at her. Nalin felt her chest tighten. She sensed that something important was being discussed, something that involved her and Sava. Still, she went about her morning duties. She filled her water pot, gathered dry wood, and prepared a small meal. Her hands moved, but her mind was filled with worry. Across the camp, Sava was also awake. She had spent most of the night sitting outside, watching the stars fade into morning. Hekani had tried to comfort her, but she could feel his frustration, even if he did not speak it aloud. When she saw the elders gathered, she clenched her hands tightly, feeling a familiar knot of fear in her stomach. As the sun climbed higher, more people began to gather near the central fire. Mothers held their children close. Young men stood in silence. Even the children, who were usually loud and playful, spoke in hushed voices. Something in the air told them this was not an ordinary day. One of the oldest elders, a woman with deep wrinkles and silver hair, stood slowly. She leaned on a carved wooden staff and looked around the camp with steady eyes. Her voice, though soft, carried across the open space. She spoke of balance, the balance between people and the land, between the living and the spirits. She reminded everyone that the Apache people had survived harsh lands, fierce enemies, and many hardships because they followed their traditions without fear. Another elder, a tall man with a long gray braid, stepped forward. He spoke more directly. He said that the tribe needed strong families to remain powerful. Children were not just blessings, but sacred responsibilities that kept the Apache bloodline alive. As they spoke, Nalin felt her heartbeat grow faster. She exchanged a nervous glance with Sava, who stood on the opposite side of the camp. Their eyes met for a brief moment, filled with shared understanding and silent fear. The elders then called for Nalin and Sava to step forward. The entire camp turned to look at them. Nalin felt her legs tremble as she walked toward the fire. The ground beneath her feet seemed heavier than usual. Sava followed beside her, her back straight, her face calm, but her eyes sharp and watchful. They stood before the elders, surrounded by their people. The heat of the fire pressed against their skin, but the cold tension in the air made them shiver. The elder woman spoke again. She did not shout or accuse. Instead, she spoke slowly, explaining that many seasons had passed since Nalin and Sava became wives. Yet no children had been born. She said that the tribe was growing concerned, not out of cruelty, but out of fear for their future. Nalin lowered her head. Tears filled her eyes, but she fought to hold them back. She wanted to explain that she had prayed, hoped, and tried in every way she knew. She wanted to say that her heart ached every day, but her voice would not come. Saba stood tall, her jaw tight. Inside, she felt anger and pain battling within her. She wanted to speak, to challenge the elders, to ask why they blamed women for something they did not fully understand. But she knew that speaking against them could bring even worse consequences. The male elder spoke next. His voice was firmer, more distant. He explained that according to ancient laws, a woman who could not bear children might be seen as bringing misfortune or weakness to the tribe. Some believed that such women were cursed or had angered the spirits. Murmurs spread through the crowd. Some people nodded in agreement. Others looked uncomfortable but remained silent. A few women wiped tears from their faces, feeling sympathy for Nalin and Sava, but powerless to act. Talo stood among the warriors, his face pale. He wanted to step forward, to defend his wife, but he feared defying the elders. His loyalty to the tribe pulled him in one direction, while his love for Nalin pulled him in another. Hekani clenched his fists. He stared at Sava, his eyes filled with conflict. He knew she was strong, kind, and loyal. Yet the weight of tradition pressed heavily on his shoulders. The elders continued speaking. They said that difficult decisions sometimes had to be made for the survival of the people. They spoke of responsibility, sacrifice, and the harsh reality of life in the desert. Nalin felt as if the world around her was spinning. The crackling of the fire sounded distant, like it was far away. She felt small, helpless, and deeply alone, even though she stood in the center of her own people. Sava, however, refused to break. She looked straight ahead, her eyes burning with quiet defiance. She would not beg. She would not cry in front of the crowd. Still, inside, her heart was trembling. Finally, the elders reached their decision. They declared that Nalin and Sava would be judged under tribal law. This did not mean immediate punishment, but it meant they were no longer seen as ordinary members of the tribe. They were placed under strict watch, separated in some ways from others, and treated with cold distance rather than warmth. Gasps rippled through the camp. Some people looked away in shame. Others stared at the ground, unwilling to meet the eyes of the two women. Nalin felt her legs nearly give out beneath her. The word judged echoed in her mind like a drumbeat. She looked toward Talo, hoping to see comfort in his face, but he avoided her gaze. Sava swallowed hard. She felt anger rising in her chest like a storm. How could her own people turn against her so easily? How could years of loyalty mean so little? In the days that followed, life became even more difficult for them. Other women no longer invited Nalin and Sava to sit with them. Some acted as if they did not exist. Children were pulled away when they came near as if their presence alone could bring bad luck. Nalin continued her chores, but the joy she once felt was gone. Every task now felt heavy, as if she were carrying an invisible burden on her shoulders. At night she lay awake, listening to the wind and wondering what would become of her. Sava, on the other hand, grew more restless. She walked farther from the camp than before, staring into the endless desert as if searching for answers. She began to question everything, the laws, the beliefs, and even the spirits she had once trusted. Meanwhile, the elders held more meetings. They spoke behind closed doors, away from the ears of the younger people. Some argued that Nalin and Sava should be given more time. Others insisted that tradition must be followed strictly. Rumors began to spread. Some said the women had truly angered the spirits. Others whispered that they would face a terrible fate if they did not prove themselves soon. Fear slowly wrapped itself around the camp like a dark blanket. One evening, as the sun set in deep red colors, Nalin and Sava were called again to stand before the elders. This time the atmosphere was even heavier. The fire burned brighter, and fewer people dared to speak. The elder woman looked at them with sadness, not hatred. She explained that the council had made a final decision. According to ancient law, women who failed to fulfill their sacred duty as mothers could no longer remain freely within the tribe. Nalin felt her world crumble. Her vision blurred, and her hands shook. She wanted to run, to scream, to disappear, but her body felt frozen in place. Sava's heart pounded like a war drum. She opened her mouth to speak, but stopped herself. She knew words would not change their minds. The elders declared that a punishment would be carried out. Not out of cruelty, they said, but as a way to restore balance and protect the tribe's future. The crowd fell silent. Even the wind seemed to stop. Talo stepped forward at last. His voice trembled as he asked for mercy. He begged the elders to reconsider, to find another way, to spare his wife. But his plea was met with cold silence. Akani also tried to speak, his voice rough with emotion, but he too was dismissed. Nalin and Sava stood side by side, facing their fate together. Though fear filled their hearts, a quiet bond between them grew stronger than ever. They were no longer just two wives. They were two women bound by shared pain and an uncertain future. As night fell over the Apache camp, the fire crackled, shadows danced across the ground, and the elders retreated to their huts. The tribe slept, but Nalin and Sava did not. They stared into the darkness, knowing that their lives were about to change forever. The desert around them remained vast and silent, holding its breath, as if waiting for the storm that was about to break. And somewhere beyond the horizon, a lone traveler was unknowingly drawing closer, someone who would soon cross paths with their destiny. The night after the elders' decision passed slowly, as if time itself did not want to move. The Apache camp sat beneath a wide blanket of stars, but there was no peace in the air. Small fires flickered softly, casting trembling light over empty spaces between the huts. The usual sounds of quiet laughter, soft songs, and drifting conversation were gone. Instead, there was only silence. Nalin sat outside her hut, wrapped in a thin leather blanket. The cool wind brushed against her face, carrying the scent of dry earth and burning wood. She stared into the darkness, her thoughts racing like wild horses. She replayed the elders' words again and again in her mind, trying to understand how her life had reached this point. She felt small beneath the endless sky, yet her heart was heavy with questions she could not answer. Inside the hut, Talo lay awake as well. He did not speak, but his breathing was slow and uneven. His mind was filled with conflict. He loved Nalin, yet he had been raised to follow the elders without question. That night he felt torn between two worlds, unable to choose either. Across the camp, Sava stood at the edge of the settlement, her bare feet planted firmly on the cold ground. She looked toward the horizon, where the desert stretched endlessly under the moonlight. Her body was tense, but her spirit was not broken. She refused to let fear swallow her completely. Still, deep inside, she wondered if this would be her last night in our homeland. Hakani sat near the fire with other warriors, but his heart was not with them. His eyes kept drifting toward the place where Sava stood. He wanted to go to her, to speak, to promise that everything would be all right, but he knew he had no power to change what was coming. As dawn approached, the sky began to lighten, shifting from deep black to soft gray. A thin line of gold appeared along the distant mountains. Slowly, the camp stirred back to life. Women moved quietly between huts, preparing for the day ahead, though their faces carried worry instead of warmth. At the same time, far beyond the Apache camp, a lone cowboy was making his way across the desert. His name was Caleb. He rode a tired brown horse that had carried him through many long journeys. Dust covered his clothes, his boots were worn, and his hat was pulled low over his eyes to block the rising sun. Caleb was not searching for trouble. He traveled from place to place, taking small jobs where he could find them, helping ranchers, guiding lost travelers, or delivering messages between distant towns. He carried little with him, just a saddlebag filled with basic supplies and a strong sense of right and wrong that guided his life. As he rode, he noticed something unusual in the distance. A thin column of smoke rose higher than normal, and he could hear faint sounds carried by the wind, low voices, distant movement, and the steady rhythm of drums. Curious, he guided his horse toward the source. The Apache camp began to prepare for the elders' gathering. People assembled once again near the central fire, though this time the mood was far more tense than before. Some women held prayer beads in their hands. Others whispered quietly, their eyes filled with fear and pity. Nayland and Sava were brought forward again, standing side by side in front of the elders. Their faces were calm, but their hearts were racing. The fire burned brightly between them and the council, its heat pressing against their skin. The elder woman spoke first, her voice filled with sadness rather than anger. She explained that the tribe must follow its laws, even when those laws were painful. She said that the decision had been made not out of hatred, but out of fear for the tribe's survival. As she spoke, the distant sound of hooves reached the edge of the camp. At first, only a few people noticed. A young boy turned his head, his eyes wide. A warrior placed his hand on his spear, sensing something unfamiliar. Moments later, Caleb appeared on the ridge overlooking the camp. He slowed his horse, taking in the scene below. He saw the gathered people, the elders seated in a circle, and two young women standing alone before them. He did not understand their language, but he could feel the heavy tension in the air. Caleb's chest tightened. He had seen enough hardship in his travels to recognize when something terrible was about to happen. Without hesitation, he urged his horse forward and began to ride down toward the camp. The Apache warriors noticed him immediately. Several men stepped forward, their expressions wary. Hands tightened around spears, and murmurs spread through the crowd. Strangers were rare in this remote land, and they were not always welcome. Caleb stopped at a respectful distance. He raised one hand slowly in a peaceful gesture, showing that he meant no harm. His other hand rested lightly on the reins, keeping his horse calm. The elders turned their attention toward him. The old woman narrowed her eyes, studying the lone rider carefully. The male elder stood, his face stern, demanding to know why this stranger had come into their land. Caleb spoke in simple words, though he knew they might not fully understand him. He said he was just a traveler passing through, seeking water and shelter. But as he looked around, his gaze fell on Nayland and Sava, standing alone before the fire. He noticed their pale faces, their trembling hands, and the fear hidden in their eyes. Something inside him stirred. He had always believed that strength was not only about survival, but about protecting those who could not protect themselves. Through gestures and broken words, Caleb made it clear that he did not wish to interfere with Apache ways. Still, he asked, as gently as he could, what was happening. Why were these two women standing apart? Why did the entire camp look so troubled? A younger Apache man, who had learned some English from previous encounters with travelers, stepped forward to translate. Slowly he explained that Nalin and Sava had been judged because they had not borne children. He said that according to their laws they could no longer remain freely among the tribe. Caleb listened carefully, his face growing more serious with each word. He did not fully understand their customs, but he understood enough to feel deep concern. In his mind, no woman deserved to suffer for something beyond her control. He took a deep breath and spoke again, this time with more firmness.
He said that in his world, women were not punished for such things.
He explained that sometimes life simply did not work as expected, and that did not make someone cursed or unworthy. Some of the warriors grew angry at his words. One stepped forward, pointing his spear toward Caleb and shouting that the stranger had no right to question their traditions. The crowd shifted uneasily, the tension rising like a storm about to break. But Caleb did not back down. He looked directly at the elders, his eyes steady and sincere. He told them that he believed the two women deserved mercy, not punishment. He reminded them that strength could also be shown through compassion. Nalin watched him with wide eyes. She could not understand everything he said, but she could see kindness in his face. For the first time since the elder's decision, a small spark of hope flickered inside her heart. Sava studied him carefully. She saw courage in his posture and determination in his voice. She felt something shift within her, a sense that perhaps her fate was not sealed after all. The elders spoke among themselves in low voices. The old woman's expression softened slightly, though the male elder remained rigid. The camp waited in anxious silence, every eye fixed on the council. Caleb then did something unexpected. He dismounted his horse and stepped forward slowly, placing himself between the elders and the two women. He did not threaten or insult anyone. Instead, he spoke calmly, saying that if punishment must happen, it should not fall on those who had done nothing wrong. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some people looked shocked, others looked moved. A few women wiped tears from their eyes, feeling their hearts stir at his bravery. Talo clenched his fists, his chest rising and falling quickly. For the first time, he felt a surge of gratitude toward this stranger who was willing to stand up when he himself had remained silent. Hekani stepped forward as well, standing beside Caleb. Though he did not speak much, his presence sent a powerful message. He was choosing compassion over fear. The elders faced a difficult moment. They had always believed that their laws were sacred and unbreakable. Yet here stood a man from another world, challenging them not with violence, but with simple humanity. After a long silence, the old woman spoke again. Her voice trembled slightly, but it carried wisdom gained over many years. She admitted that perhaps the tribe had been too harsh in its fear. She acknowledged that the spirits worked in ways humans could not always understand. The male elder hesitated. His pride fought against his heart, but he could not ignore the growing unease among the people. Slowly, he lowered his gaze, signaling that the council would reconsider. Caleb stepped back slightly, giving them space. He bowed his head in respect, showing that he did not seek to dominate or humiliate them. After further quiet discussion, the elders made a new decision. They declared that Nalin and Sava would not face immediate punishment. Instead, they would be allowed to leave the camp safely under Caleb's protection if they chose to do so. This way, the tribe would not feel bound to break its laws, and the women would not be harmed. A collective breath swept through the crowd. Some people looked relieved, others conflicted, but no one moved to stop the decision. Nalin felt tears spill down her cheeks, not from fear this time, but from overwhelming emotion. She turned toward Caleb, her eyes filled with gratitude she could not put into words. Sava stood tall, her shoulders relaxing slightly for the first time in days. She looked at the cowboy with respect, recognizing that he had risked his life for them without even knowing their names. Caleb walked toward them slowly. He spoke gently, assuring them that he would help them reach a safe place beyond the desert. He did not promise an easy journey, but he promised to protect them as best he could. The camp began to shift around them. Some women approached Nalin and Sava quietly, pressing small bundles of food, water, and blankets into their hands. Though the tribe could not openly support them, these silent gestures showed that not all hearts had turned cold. Talo stepped forward at last. His face was filled with pain and love. He placed his hands on Nalin's shoulders, speaking softly in their language. Though she could not stay, he wanted her to live. Nalin touched his hand gently, tears streaming down her face as she said her quiet goodbye. Hakani approached Sava, his eyes burning with emotion. He said few words, but his meaning was clear. He would never forget her. Sava met his gaze with strength, holding her head high even in heartbreak. As the sun climbed higher into the sky, Caleb helped the two women onto his horse, guiding them carefully. He gathered his supplies and prepared for the long journey ahead. The Apache camp watched in silence as the lone cowboy and the two brides slowly rode away toward the open desert. Dust rose behind them, blurring their figures against the bright horizon. Behind them, the tribe remained standing around the central fire, forever changed by what had happened. Ahead of them, Nalin and Sava faced a world they had never known. Frightening, vast, and uncertain, yet filled with the promise of life. As Ben and the two Apache women made their way through the rugged landscape, they could feel the tension building in the air. Each step they took carried the weight of their decision, and they knew that time was running out. The Apache warriors were relentless, and though they had managed to keep their distance for a while, it was only a matter of time before they were caught. But Ben wasn't going to give up. He had promised to protect these women, and he intended to keep that promise, no matter the cost. The sun had just begun to set, casting long shadows over the dry earth. Ben's horse trotted steadily, its hooves crunching on the gravel path, while the two women followed closely behind. Their pace had slowed, exhaustion starting to take its toll, but they couldn't afford to rest for long. They needed to keep moving. Suddenly, a rustling sound broke the silence, and Ben's instincts kicked in. He pulled the reins of his horse to a halt, causing it to stop abruptly. His eyes darted around the surrounding terrain, searching for any sign of danger. He could feel his pulse quicken as the tension in the air thickened. "Stay close," he whispered to the women. His voice was low, steady, but they could hear the edge of concern in it. They didn't need to be told twice. They huddled closer to Ben, their hearts racing as they too scanned the horizon. The silence that followed was deafening, and for a moment it seemed like nothing would happen. But then, out of the corner of his eye, Ben saw movement. A group of Apache warriors appeared from behind a cluster of rocks. They had found them. Ben's heart sank. He had been hoping to avoid this confrontation, but now it was inevitable. The warriors, with their war paint and fierce expressions, rode in with the kind of confidence that only comes from years of battle. Their horses kicked up clouds of dust as they charged toward them. Ben felt a surge of anger and determination. He wasn't going to let these women be taken back to their tribe. They had suffered enough. He had seen the pain in their eyes, and he wasn't about to let it continue. He drew his rifle from its holster, his fingers gripping it tightly as he prepared for what was coming. The leader of the Apache warriors, a tall man with a scar running down his cheek, raised his hand, signaling for the others to halt. The group came to a stop a few feet away from Ben and the two women. The tension between them was thick, the air charged with hostility. It was clear that neither side was going to back down easily. Ben stood his ground, his rifle pointed slightly downward, but ready to raise if necessary. He could see the anger in the eyes of the Apache leader, but he also saw something else, something deeper. There was a sense of pride in the man's gaze, a pride that came from his role as protector of the tribe. "These women are under my protection," Ben said, his voice firm and unwavering. "I won't let you take them." The leader's eyes narrowed. "You have no place here, cowboy," he said, his voice a low growl. "These women belong to our tribe. You cannot change their fate."
"I don't care about your laws," Ben replied. "What you did to them was wrong."
"They deserve a chance at a life of their own, not to be treated like prisoners." The words hung in the air between them. The Apache warriors shifted nervously, unsure of how to respond to Ben's defiance. They were warriors, trained to fight, to defend their people, but they weren't used to dealing with someone who wasn't afraid to stand up to them. For a long moment, neither side moved. The only sound was the wind whispering through the desert, carrying with it the scent of dust and dry earth. Ben's heart raced, his mind calculating his next move. He knew that a fight would mean certain death for all of them, but he wasn't about to let these women return to the life they had fled. The women, standing quietly behind him, were holding their breath. They had never seen a man stand up to the Apache warriors like this. Their entire lives had been shaped by the tribe's rules, and they had never imagined someone would challenge that power. But here Ben was, not just challenging their fate, but offering them something they had never dreamed of. A choice. One of the women, the younger of the two, took a deep breath and stepped forward. "We don't belong to the tribe anymore," she said, her voice strong but trembling with emotion. "We are free." Her words echoed in the stillness, and for a moment even the Apache warriors seemed taken aback. The leader stared at her, his face hardening as he processed her words, but there was no anger in his eyes now, only a flicker of something else. Perhaps respect, perhaps something else entirely. Ben watched as the women made their decision. He had known they were strong, but seeing them stand up for themselves, for their future, filled him with pride. They weren't the same women who had been condemned to die in the desert. They had found their voice, and nothing, not even the Apache tribe, could take that from them now. "Then go!" the leader said, his voice softer now, almost resigned. "Go and live your lives. But know this, you will always be marked by what you did. You are no longer part of our tribe." The words stung, but the women stood tall, unshaken. Ben nodded in silent acknowledgement, knowing that the fight had ended, not with violence, but with a decision. A decision that would change the course of their lives forever. As the Apache warriors turned and rode off into the distance, Ben and the two women were left standing in the stillness of the desert. The sun had set completely now, and the cool night air settled around them like a blanket. They had made it. They had faced the impossible and come out the other side stronger than before. The women were no longer prisoners of their past. They were free, and together they would build a new life. The journey ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time they felt a sense of hope. A hope that, Ben by their side, they could overcome anything the future might throw their way. And as they walked into the night side by side, they knew that the world was theirs to shape, just as they had shaped their own destiny. The days following their escape were filled with a sense of peace, a peace that was hard to believe after everything they had endured. Ben, the two women, and his horse had found a new home in the heart of the desert, far from the tribe's reach. The land was vast and empty, with nothing but the sound of the wind to break the silence. It was the perfect place for them to begin again, to rebuild their lives away from the pain of their past. Ben's cabin, a simple structure made of logs and stones, stood quietly amidst the desert's rugged beauty. It wasn't much, but it was their sanctuary, a place where they could heal and find solace. The women, once broken by the cruelty of their tribe's customs, began to blossom. They were no longer prisoners of shame. They were free to be themselves, to make their own choices, and to live a life they could call their own. The younger of the two women, whose name was Ayana, was the first to start embracing her new life. She had always been shy, her spirit dulled by years of rejection and judgment. But in the quiet of the desert, with the sound of the wind and the vast sky above her, Ayana began to find a sense of peace. She started to learn new skills, farming, gathering, and cooking. The land, harsh as it seemed at first, slowly began to reveal its secrets. She learned how to find water in the dry earth, how to tend to the few plants that could survive in the heat, and how to make a life out of what seemed like nothing. Her confidence grew each day, and as she worked alongside Ben, she began to see herself differently. She was no longer just a woman who had been cast aside by her people. She was a survivor. And more than that, she was someone who could build a future filled with hope and possibility. The older woman, named Tala, was more cautious. She had lived through many hardships, and the scars of her past ran deep. Her heart had been broken by her tribe's treatment, and though she was grateful for Ben's help, she couldn't fully shake the feeling of guilt that had haunted her for so long. She had been taught to believe that her worth was tied to her ability to bear children, and the shame of infertility had taken root in her soul. But as the days passed, Tala began to realize that her value wasn't defined by what others thought of her. She was more than her ability to conceive. She was strong, capable, and intelligent. Her mind, sharp and insightful, began to turn toward new possibilities. Tala had always been skilled in storytelling, a gift passed down through generations of her people. In the desert, With the stars as her backdrop, she began to share the stories of her tribe, not as a way to relive the past, but as a way to honor her heritage. She taught Ayana and Ben the old ways of the Apache, the songs, the dances, and the traditions that had once been so important to her but had been lost in the rush of survival. Through storytelling, Tala found healing. She no longer felt the weight of her infertility as a burden, but rather as a part of her journey. It was the story of her life, a story that was still being written. And with each word she spoke, she began to reclaim the power that had once been stripped away from her. Ben, watching the women grow stronger each day, couldn't help but feel a deep sense of pride. He had known them when they were broken, when they had been on the edge of death, and now, seeing them flourish gave him hope. His own life had been a solitary one, filled with hard work and little connection. But now, in this small desert cabin, he found himself part of something greater than himself. He had become their protector, yes, but he had also become their partner, their friend, and their family. They spent their days working together, building something that felt real, something they could hold on to. The desert, which had once felt like a harsh and unforgiving place, began to feel like home. Each morning they rose with the sun, and each night they sat together around the fire, sharing stories, laughing, and finding comfort in each other's company. The bond between them grew stronger with each passing day, a bond that was forged in the fires of adversity. As time went on, the seasons began to change. The blistering heat of summer gave way to the cool, crisp winds of fall. The nights grew longer, and the desert, once empty and silent, came alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures. The women, once afraid to venture far from the cabin, began to explore the land around them. They learned how to navigate the rocky terrain, how to spot signs of life in the vast emptiness, and how to find beauty in the smallest of things. The delicate bloom of a desert flower, the quiet flight of an owl across the moonlit sky. Their lives were not easy. The desert was a harsh teacher, and the days were long. But they were together, and that made all the difference. They had each other's backs, and that was more than they had ever known before. They no longer had to answer to anyone but themselves. They had broken free from the chains of tradition, and now they were free to live on their own terms. Ben, though content with his new life, couldn't help but think of the world beyond the desert. He had spent so many years wandering, so many years living on the fringes of society. But now, with Ayana and Tala by his side, he wondered if there was a place for them in the world beyond the desert. Could they ever go back to the towns they had once known? Would people accept them? Or would they always be seen as outcasts? He didn't have the answers, but for the first time it didn't matter. He had found a family in Ayana and Tala, and together they had created something that no one could take away from them. The desert had shaped them, yes, but it had also given them the strength to shape their own futures. One evening, as they sat together under the stars, Ben spoke of the future. "We've made a good life here," he said, his voice steady but thoughtful. "But there's more to the world than this desert. Maybe it's time to see what else is out there." Ayana and Tala exchanged glances, their faces illuminated by the firelight. They had come so far, and the thought of leaving the desert, of venturing into the unknown, filled them with both excitement and fear. But one thing was certain: they were no longer the women they had once been. They had learned to survive, to adapt, and to thrive. And whatever the future held, they would face it together. With the stars above them and the desert at their feet, they made a vow to one another, to live with courage, to embrace the unknown, and to never let go of the strength they had found within themselves. And as the fire burned low and the night grew still, they knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them with the same resilience and determination that had brought them this far. Their journey was far from over, but it had only just begun.